My name is Esmeralda. I am from Mexico. My country is very beautiful, but is also very poor, and so many of us have to emigrate. My life in my country was a beautiful life, because that is where I grew up, with my parents and my siblings. We lived poorly, but we were very united. What I liked most was the food and the place where I lived, which was in the country, without having to worry about how to pay rent, how to pay electricity, or how to pay for water. So many times it is very sad not to have a job and a little bit of food. I miss the people. I miss the food. I miss the natural beauty of the ranch where I grew up, and my parents and brothers and sisters. I have the hope to go back and be with them so that I can enjoy the nature and the food and the water and many more things. My life in the U.S. has been very difficult since I arrived. It has been very sad. I was alone with nothing and with no one. It was very difficult because my dream was something totally different than what I thought. I thought when I arrived that everything would be easier, but it was not. I suffered a lot. I didn't have the liberty to be where I want, but after all my suffering, I have my family now. I have my husband, I have my life, I have my son. And I thought before that I could not move forward, but now things are changing. After all this suffering, I realized that here in the U.S., it doesn't matter who you are or where you came from. If you don't have people to support you, then you can't move forward. There have been people in places, and they have opened the doors for me and my family. I am okay now. I'm not saying I'm very happy, because I don't have my parents with me, but I am doing better than before, and I am learning many, many things, and I know I will learn many more. My name is Momo Kahing. I came from Thailand. Actually, I was born in Iradi Division, Poi Pon Village, Miramar. I love Miramar. We are 4 brothers and sisters. After I got married, I followed my husband. Life in Burma is very difficult, so I could not complete my education due to my parents' difficulty. They could not put me in school. I have a very limited education. That's the reason I got married, and I followed my husband wherever he went. I have 2 kids. My husband took me to the refugee camp. In the refugee camp, everyday life is tough, hard, but fortunately we crossed over all that situation. The future for my children is hopeless in a refugee camp. The food and everything they provide is difficult, but fortunately we survived 7 years in the refugee camp. At that time, I got a very good opportunity to resettle to the United States. I got an interview and medical tests completed, and we came to America. After we got here in the United States, it is a very developed country, especially for my kids. I have a very positive view and deep hope for them. And I know that there is a good opportunity as much as we try ourselves. And so the future is open here, and I feel safe in our life here. Our lives are protected, especially the family life. If we try, we get what we work for. I try to solve my personal difficulties. I want to rely on myself. The people of the United States, their warm welcome gave me strength. My name is Habibo Sheikh. I am from Somalia. In Somalia, I did not have an opportunity to go to school because of the violence, but I always wanted to go to school and have an education. Although I didn't have that opportunity, I like to work, and I'm looking for an opportunity that gives me a job that I can do. In this time of my life, I am optimistic. I am optimistic that I will get a job somehow. My name is Berka Bahadur Golan. I am from Bhutan. In my country, I worked in construction and as a security guard. There were rivers in the country, so I went to the rivers and collected stone, sand, and aggregate, and sold the aggregate, stones, and sand, and in that way I made income to support my family. From that, I used to buy meat and other necessary items. Also, I used to raise pigs, chickens, and ducks, and I also used to work in the fields. The life in America is good. Now, it is very good. But we don't know in the future. It is unknown. But people say America is very good for living, so I think so. In the future, I think I will be the same as other people. I don't have much to say because I am very new here. My name is Mohammed Saeed. I am from Iraq, but I lived in Baghdad since birth. But as a family, we lived in the north. I have been living alone in Baghdad, and all these problems and fear and instability. But my aim in Baghdad was to get married and become a family. But I couldn't because of the hardship. It was very hard to get a job. Every day you hear death or news that it's not healthy, not good. So for the last 7 years, I tried to escape from there and come to the United States of America. That was my dream. I was thinking day and night how to go there and what is the process to come here. But it was hard because hundreds and hundreds want the same dream that I had. Many want to come here. It was hard. Then luckily, I got through the process and came here in February 2013. So now I'm starting my dream, my forever dream, that I will be living here in the U.S. and all this healthy life and freedom, and I am exercising now. I am seeing a great difference that what I had dreamed and now I am in my real dream. Even I help some of new Iraqis. They need something they don't know how, that I know, and the life is good. Everybody coming here as a refugee, they have their own different dreams. So now hopefully I will make a family and hopefully I will live here in this beautiful country. Well, there you go. There's a handful of stories of refugees that have come to America seeking a better life, seeking education, healthcare, food, sanity, safety, a better life for their children, for their parents. Human beings who are seeking asylum in a country that was founded on the concept of asylum. The conversation I had that follows is with Andrew Arehart, and he helps assimilate refugees once they get to America and have passed all the millions of tests. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope you do too. And I don't have much more to say about that other than there'll be links, of course, on heyhumanpodcast.com, references to what Andrew and I discuss, and thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Hi, Andrew.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, no, I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you. My name is Andrew Arehart, and I've worked with immigrants and refugees primarily since about 2008, when in Portland, Oregon, I got involved with an outfit called the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization. And the work that I did for them I'm an instructional designer, so I build training programs. And so I was building training programs for cultural adaptation and workplace skills adaptation to help refugees adapt to living in the U.S. So building programs on how do you interact with the police, how do you interact with your children's teachers, how do you interact with the medical system, the banking systems, things like that. And then for workforce, how do you communicate your skills? What are some cultural norms around interviews? How do you fill out job applications? A lot of kind of rubber hits the road sort of stuff. So that's the work that I've done. I worked for them from 2008 until end of 2015. And then more recently, I've been here in Nashville, Tennessee. I've done a little bit of work with some of the communities here. There's a big Zomi community here in Nashville. Zomi? The Zomi are one of the minority ethnic groups of Burma or Myanmar, and those words are somewhat controversial themselves. You know, who likes to use which term? It's an incredibly complex part of the world, and I would say that one thing that we can say generally about refugees is there is no one typical refugee, except for the fact, the kind of the defining thing with refugees is the story usually starts with the soldiers came and things went downhill in apocalyptic ways after that. Yeah. But they're from all over the world. They're of all faiths. They're of all educational backgrounds. I think that we tend to think of a refugee as being someone huddled against a dust storm, that's been living out in the jungle somewhere or in the desert.
These are doctors and lawyers.
And these are doctors
and
lawyers and literally like hydraulics engineers and dentists and judges and mechanics and farmers and people who are illiterate in their native languages.
I think that's a really good point that there is this image of what a refugee stands for, especially in America.
Right.
Now, maybe more so ever than it was when our grandparents,
this business with the Syrians right now has brought a lot of interest in Syrian refugees, and certainly that's significant. Certainly even I can't really imagine how bad things are in Syria. But this has drawn a lot of attention to the refugee crisis. But there are and there have been refugees from all over the world steadily. I mean, this is not a new thing. This has been going on for a long time. And the U.S. actually resettles a whole lot of refugees, and we have a reasonably good program here, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the details.
So before we get into the nuts and bolts of all of that,
sure.
What I mean, that's quite a mission for a man to take on in his life. What made you decide to go into this?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I felt like I was very fortunate to be getting a paycheck for something that I really love to do.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of a sexy occupation, I mean, it's a neat way to make a living. I can't complain about it at all. I did get laid off from my job in 2015, and so the funding can be pretty tenuous, but, you just got to get in there and figure it out. I'm not too worried about it.
So what brought you to this career path?
Well, I fundamentally, for me, everything proceeds from really believing that we're all brothers and sisters. And so I think that my time in the world is best used by, serving other people. And so that's I think that I'm just, it's kind of a calling thing.
Yeah.
I'm in
You're a human being?
I'm a human, yeah. And I really appreciate and value other humans, or try to.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
So one of the things, if you don't mind, let me turn the questions around and see kind of what you might know. How would you define the difference between a refugee and an immigrant?
That's a good question. I would think that a refugee is someone who comes out of a situation that's hostile and tenuous and arrives into a situation where they're not prepared whatsoever. They've just sort of been cold, stuck on a vehicle of some sort of transport, and off they're shipped to whatever receiving place there is. And an immigrant, to me, has a plan, I guess, or even family.
Okay.
From the immigrant, quote unquote, that I know, the Kurds, a couple of Kurds that I know, there's a large Kurdish population here. There's such a huge network here.
Right.
So when they immigrate here, they're assimilated.
Right.
And also, I think an immigrant is somebody that, in my mind, somebody that has made the application process, I guess. I don't know. It sounds more legal than, not that a refugee is illegal, but I mean the concept of a refugee is basically just showing up and going, please, somebody, for God's sake, help me.
Well, the issues of legality are certainly part of it, and you also bring up the significance of arriving in to a town or whatever where there's already people of your background have already shown up. Like if I was a Kurd and showed up in Nashville, there's a huge Kurdish community here, and how much more challenging it is if, like, literally back in Portland, I knew a guy who, he was the only guy, there was one other guy in 3 counties that spoke his language.
That's
so
tough.
the differences between showing up where there is a community and when there's not already a community developed can be pretty significant.
I mean, there are people that both speak English that don't communicate well.
Sure.
So then throw into the mix a whole other language. And that's going to be terrifying for the person.
Well, it's kind of it's a huge mountain to climb to adjust to living in a new culture for anybody. I mean, I lived in Japan for a while, and that's tough. And I could come home any time I wanted to, and I had a job, and and all kinds of things. So,
and people spoke English.
Some, but and in fact, I think that's one of the things I'd like to explore with you today: the significance of people's. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the capacity to learn to speak English, and how does that happen, and the significance of it, and how that relates to assimilation and integration.
It's a really difficult language.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, you put a man on the moon. Others have done it, and others will continue to do it. It can be done. There's a lot around that. But to come back to the idea of legally what a refugee is, by definition, the people who headed out of New Orleans after Katrina, those are refugees. They couldn't stay where they were for some reason. Okay, the folks that are leaving LA right now because of the fires, technically they're refugees.
That makes sense.
Okay, something happened that you can't stay home. Basically, that's kind of a good way. And when I say can't, it's like you can't stay where you were. There's no option for many folks but to leave. I think that most people would rather have stayed home and been happy cruising along with their lives there than to have been forced to leave to a second country or to do third country repatriation, which is what we see when refugees come to the U.S. So there's an outfit called the United Nations High Council on Refugees, and there is a legal status of refugee. So when somebody comes here as a refugee, they're legal to work, They're legal to, their kids can go to school, they can access medical care, they're all here legally. There's no legal status. The government knows that they're here, and they've gone through a pretty significant vetting process that we'll talk about here in a little while. But the definition, according to the UNHCR, if you don't mind, I'm going to read this off to you because I don't know it off the top of my head. Okay, so this is how the United Nations High Council on Refugees defines a refugee. Owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country or return there because there is a fear of persecution. So basically there are some criteria, there are some legal criteria that you must meet to be recognized as a refugee. Okay, and so that's significant. So when we talk about refugees coming here to the U.S., they've gone through a vetting process and they have met this definition of what a refugee is. Okay, so any questions about that?
No,
that
makes sense.
Okay, so and again, this will be the second and only thing that I'll just straight up read to you, if you don't mind. There was an excellent short publication that was put together by the folks in Greensboro, the Center for New North Carolinians of Refugee Fact Checkers, and I think it's worth going through this to kind of flesh out what is that vetting process.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Do you mind me reading?
I don't. In fact, I think that's important because in general, in America, I'm not going to speak for other countries. I don't know how they feel about refugees, but just from the things I've read online and news and social medias and stuff, people are pretty ignorant about it, and they're just concerned that basically they're just piling up terrorists and shipping them into America. That's the rhetoric, which is insane.
Well, we have, our situation is distinct from what's happening in Europe, and that just physically, geologically, you can't just have thousands and thousands of people walking into the U.S. in the way that Europe is seen. I think it's dismissive to say that people who are concerned about the refugee crisis and what it's going to do to their native countries and the influx of large numbers of people, that is a concern. That affects everything. Even here in Nashville, we think about 80 people a day who are moving here, and what's that going to do to our schools and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So that can't be good. But no, anytime a whole lot of people show up into a system and are needing to access services and learn to contribute to that system, it's a huge deal. And so I really try not to either demonize the people who are concerned about huge numbers of people from different language, cultural backgrounds, and unknown safety issues showing up. It's not crazy to be concerned about that. And it's also not crazy to care about these people. And I think the key is to help them become contributing members as quickly as possible. And I think that is what most refugees urgently desire to do. So anyway, let's get back to this this business on the vetting process. Okay, so again, this was put together by the fine folks over at the Center for New North Carolinians over in Greensboro. And okay, so definitions. The terms refugee and asylum seeker are often used interchangeably. However, their political meanings are very different. Now, we just covered the definition of refugee.
Right.
Okay, so the owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted and so on and so forth. An asylum seeker is someone who says he or she is a refugee, but whose claim has not yet been definitively evaluated. Okay, so again, this implication that a refugee, the legal status of a refugee is somebody who's been vetted, their case has been reviewed. An asylum seeker is somebody who's shown up and says that they are a refugee. And by definition, they are a refugee, but not by legal definition.
The thing that comes to mind when I hear that is Olympians all the time. It seems like in the 80s, people were asylum seekers who were, gymnasts and... You know what I mean? That's the thing that comes to mind.
Right. The Russians who wanted to defect into the... Okay, right. I remember about that.
That's what comes to mind for me.
All right. And if you'll notice when you're watching the news about refugee issues now, you'll hear, especially in reference to what's going on in Europe, asylum seeker. Okay, and again, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who have suddenly showed up into the system.
Sure.
Okay, until they have been vetted, they are asylum seekers. Okay. And so I think it's good to know the difference between a refugee and asylum seekers.
So once they've gone through the vetting process,
then they can be granted the legal status of a refugee.
And
okay.
all that comes with that.
And all that comes with that, right. Okay, so moving on then, when large masses of refugees flee a country at the same time, there is not the capacity to conduct individual asylum interviews for everyone. This can result in large groups being declared prima facie refugees, and I may have mispronounced that. It's F-A-C-I-E. Because prima facie? Thank you.
My Latin is rough from childhood.
Well, mine is apparently rougher. So, because of its geographic location, the U.S. will never experience large numbers of prima facie refugees arriving from Syria. And I will note that this document was put together mostly in reference to what's going on with the Syrian refugee crisis. Okay, so general considerations. Systems evaluate the claims of asylum seekers to assess whether or not the individual or family unit actually qualifies for international protection under the refugee designation. To qualify for refugee status, the individual cannot have been engaged in any fighting or terrorist activities. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, resettlement to the United States. Obtaining refugee or prima facie...
It doesn't... We'll look it up later.
refugee status does not make an individual eligible for resettlement to the U.S. Okay, so even if in the border country where they've gone to, just having been recognized as a refugee does not yet enable them to come to the U.S.
Yeah, it's only the first...
That's the first step, right? Yeah. That's the first hurdle. Medical and security checks must be completed before a refugee will be considered for resettlement in the U.S.
There are a lot of diseases happening in other countries that we've got under control here.
Right. Well, here in Nashville, recently there was a lawmaker who was he was making a pushback against refugees being resettled here on tuberculosis. Yeah. Tuberculosis. I've known a lot of folks who have had to be treated for tuberculosis in Portland. It's not not a shock to people who are used to refugees coming into a system for them to have diseases that need to be addressed.
I mean, I went to England a few years back and spent some time, and they tested me for TB when I got back. It's just part of the deal. It's just the deal.
Right. So again, I don't like to demonize people for saying there's this concern. Let's be aware of this concern, but this is not a deal breaker concern in my opinion.
Right, but it makes sense that the gatekeepers would make sure that you're not, don't have Ebola or something, or some, the plague or whatever.
Yeah, we're trying to cut down on plague.
Yeah, it comes up every now and again.
Sure.
The United States had a bubonic plague outbreak a little while ago.
Did we?
Yeah, I can't remember which state. I have a very dear friend in the CDC, very high ranking in the CDC, and she and I have these intense talks that are, she's like, if you knew what I knew, you'd never leave your house. Anyway, go on.
Okay, so again, back to the document. Security measures in place. Refugees are vetted through background check processes involving the U.S. Departments of State, Homeland Security, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the Federal Bureau of Investigations, among other national intelligence agencies. Background checks use biometric data, including fingerprints and retina scans. The average background check takes between 18 and 24 months to complete.
My goodness. So where do they stay during all this? Are there detention places?
We're talking about all over the world. And so this would be prior to coming to the United States. Somebody wouldn't arrive here without having gone through this process.
So I'm somebody that's fleeing my country. Right. There's chaos reigning supreme. And I reach out to America and say, hey, would you take me in? Right. And then the 2-year process begins of where I'm being vetted by America's
So let's say you're in Somalia, you leave Somalia, a good chance is you're going to go to Kenya, and then maybe you're going to be there a month, maybe you're going to be there 15, 18 years, maybe you're going to die there. You have no way of knowing, okay? But that's where you'll have to go through the vetting process.
But so we have people there, or are they Skyping?
Yes. I don't know the details of how that goes down, to be honest with you.
All right.
But the vetting process takes place outside
of the country.
US.
Got
it. And this is for Syrians or folks out of Bhutan or folks out of Iraq or
Sure.
Folks out of anywhere. This is a process that they all go through before coming here. Okay. Now, specific to the Syrians, Syrian refugee applicants already have to go through additional security measures. And again, I'm reading again from the document here. U.S. intelligence agencies rely on their own intelligence and the intelligence of their allies. They do not rely solely on source country data, which may be inadequate or unreliable. Of the 784,000 refugees who have resettled in the U.S. since 9/11, 3 have been arrested for terrorist activities.
Read that statistic again, please.
Of the 784,000 refugees who have resettled in the U.S. since 9/11, 3 have been arrested for terrorist activities. 2 of the 3 were planning attacks outside the U.S. Now, this data is based on 2015 figures.
Okay, but I think that's so important. I mean, that is a tiny fraction. There have been more domestic acts of terrorism by our own, by Americans than there have been by refugees. Yes. I just think that's a really important thing.
I do too. You can always bend statistics around and whatnot, but those are some pretty significant numbers. Yeah,
2 or 3.
Yeah. If there's any doubt, and again from the document, if there's any doubt that an individual poses a security concern, he or she will not be selected for resettlement and are removed from further refugee processing. Now, that's all from the document. One thing that I would say, having spoken to a dear friend of mine from the Middle East, the U.S. for a lot of people is not their first choice of where they would want to go, not because they don't value our culture or our freedoms or anything like that.
I say that all the time. Why don't you want to come here?
Well,
we're so mean.
We're
like
freedom
the mean
and
girl
opportunity.
in high school.
As Americans, it's hard for us to see the significance of freedom and opportunity that realistically do exist here.
I look at us like the mean girl in high school, like the head cheerleader. And she's like, I'm so cool.
We can be kind of the cool kids. Yeah. But we are not who we think we are as Americans. Americans are everybody. Anybody. That's the thing. This is a multicultural country, and so. But this fellow was telling me that from his community, it's well known that it's a 1 or 2 year process just to get vetted to come to the United States. So that's a big challenge. So you're just going to be stuck somewhere until you go through that whole process, and then maybe you don't get approved for any one of a number of reasons.
Do you have statistics on
how
comparatively versus non-approved?
No, I don't. But if you like, I'll follow up on that.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
I can Google it.
Okay. And then another reason why it's more attractive to go to some other countries is there are more robust support systems. Like maybe you get to go to a country where your kids are going to get to go to college for free, or there's free medical care, or the cost of living is significantly lower. The U.S. is a tough place to come to, because it's a real sink or swim outfit. Refugees will get about 6 months of support upon having arrived, which is basically food stamps and some health care. They get like a month or 2 of rent covered, and then they're on their own. And so you're talking about, for a lot of folks, even some are fortunate to show up with language skills, many are not, and so many are just scrambling to get that first job, and to again and again and again, refugees talk to me about their desire to become contributing members of the culture that they're living in. And that's one of the things that they feel as adults, one of the greatest losses that they experience is that in their country, they were a person of significance, they knew how to do things, they knew how to contribute, and to have been in limbo for a month or 5 years or 20 years.
What that would do to a man, a woman,
what that would do to anybody, just to be, on the sidelines of your life with no control over that next step. I mean, I've been out of work for about a year now. I've been very fortunate to have a big fat savings account, and to have been able to do some kind of piecemeal work here and there. But it's been horribly mentally disrupting to me to be disconnected from the work that I do that's a contribution to the world that I live in. And I eat every day and sleep inside, so my situation is pretty easy.
Right.
So my heart just really goes out to folks. And you're talking about, in the refugee camps, your kids let's say your kids don't go to school for 4 or 5 years. What happens to them when they then get to another country? What happens, you miss a generation of education. Your whole culture just hit the bricks. Okay, that's one of the things that's happening with the Syrians.
So does the Red Cross go in and give do they help with that sort of thing? Or?
There is there are degrees of support, but there's.
Is it a police state once inside a refugee camp? I mean, are they protected?
I'm very fortunate to. In November, I'm going to be visiting Burma and visiting some of the refugee camps that are on the Thai-Burma border, and we'll have a little bit better of a sense of that. I would encourage anybody to just do some YouTube videos on refugee camps and get a sense of what's really going on there. That's the other end of the tunnel from what I'm familiar with now. What I see is people emerging from this tunnel of having been in limbo and now trying to adapt to what it's like in the States.
Do they provide psychological services too?
We're talking about
here.
Places. Oh, yes.
Once they get here.
I think that will vary depending on the services systems that are set up wherever you land. I know that in Portland there was some psychological support available, but then think about the challenge of how do you
language.
Exactly. How do you provide really good psychological support, an English speaker to an English speaker? Now, how are you going to do that to a Karen speaker? I mean, when there's nobody in town who speaks the language, the challenges of providing that are not insignificant. And I think if anything, what I've learned from spending time around refugees is that I'm just amazed by how often they just show up with their game face and they're just ready to try to make things work. I see so little of the trauma, that I know they've experienced. So they're really a remarkable bunch of people. So
Wow. So explain. So now I'm here. I've made it through the vetting process.
Okay.
Do I get introduced to somebody like you? How long till I meet you?
Okay, well, I can tell you about the system that I was involved with in Portland. Okay, and it varies from city to city and place to place. I know.
And not every state has.
No, there are about a dozen cities in the U.S. that are. I've heard them referred to as asylum cities. I think on the radio recently, but basically Nashville is one of them. Nashville, I call them refugee cities because that's kind of the world that I work in. Nashville's a refugee city. St. Paul, Minneapolis is a refugee city. Houston, New York, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle. So there are a number of cities that were designated, I think back in the 70s is when most of the systems were set up, that provide services for refugees on arrival. Now, as a refugee, if you show up as a refugee, you can go wherever the hell you want to go, okay, because you're here legally. Most likely, you're going to go someplace that you have family or friends.
Makes sense.
That's a huge benefit if you can. And most likely, you're going to go to a city that has some sort of refugee services set up. So in the system that I was working in Portland, someone would arrive, and one of the volunteer agencies, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Family Services, and I apologize, there's also a Jewish-oriented outfit that does this. The services are not denomination or religion specific, in terms of who they serve. These are just outfits that have service systems set up. Someone will meet you at the airport. Someone will have already found you an apartment, furnished apartment. And this, some of the refugee apartments that I've seen, they're just living in really pretty bad conditions in some cases, and in some cases in pretty fair conditions. So that it can be all over the board on that. It's not a big, happy, huge free ride. I mean, it's just barely getting by in a lot of circumstances, especially in a popular city like Portland or Nashville, where the rents are going through the roof. You can imagine what challenges that puts on placing refugees into housing. Okay, so you get a ride from the airport to your new apartment, and you got a place to sleep, and within the first week, you will go through medical screening and testing, and any medical issues that need to be addressed will be addressed. And then you show up at a place like where I used to work, and you will take another screening to determine your English language level. And based on those English language levels, you'd be placed into different levels of classes And the classes that we provided were focused entirely on cultural adaptation and getting the person ready to engage in the job search as quick as possible. The goal is for people to become self-supporting as quickly as possible. That's the overarching goal of the system, is to get people self-supporting through, and employment is considered the route for doing that. Okay, so as you're going through these classes, you've got about 6 months. You're eligible for those classes for about 6 months. And during that time, you're working with what's called a job coach or an employment specialist who's also working to connect you to employers in the area. So a lot of folks naturally go into food production and hospitality and kind of some of the entry-level sort of positions that you would imagine somebody would go into. And, again, so this makes us think about what are some of the challenges for someone who is illiterate in their own language. This is one example, somebody who can't read and write in their own language. Trying to hold down a job as a housekeeper is going to be pretty tough here in the U.S. with no language skills. Often, however, with a great desire to work. The other side of that coin is you take this hydroelectric engineer who's in the same boat. Somebody who has been fantastically able to contribute to their culture and their family and their well-being. Now they're trying to get a job as a housekeeper. Jeez. And what that does to somebody. Yeah. So you're talking about just people from a really broad spectrum of backgrounds who are trying to, again and again and again, my honest belief is really trying to become contributors just as quickly as they can. They want their kids to be okay. They want themselves to be okay. And they're here. They have the human They want to invest in being here. I really don't have much of a sense of people showing up here looking forward to a free ride or anything like that. Most people are really happy to get that first job and to try to get things off the ground. So that's kind of that's kind of what happens. Now, to go a little bit further with your question of what happens when you arrive here. Okay, so you've got a place to stay that you are responsible for paying your rent. I've almost never been to a refugee's house that the lights were turned on in the daytime because there's no money for electric or utilities or anything like that. You've got your rent covered for a couple of months, but everything else is on you. And so you got people living pretty cheap, saving money in any way that they can, often finding ways to make it work because the human capacity to survive is just so astounding.
Absolutely.
So, like if I come to a new country and my kids are going to start going to school. Okay, so I'm going to take this from the perspective of maybe a young father, young family. Okay, my kids are going to start going to school. They're going to pick up English pretty quickly because they're a little bit younger, and that's the way we're built. We can pick up languages more easily when we're young. But the real deal is they're picking up the language faster because they're listening, reading, writing, and speaking in English for 8 hours a day.
It's immersion.
It's the in-depth, it's the time spent in the language that enables you to pick it up. Okay, so now me as the young father, I may be fortunate to get a job. Now let's compare the difference between if I get a job as a cashier or if I get a job in a production facility. Okay, in the production facility, my need to communicate in English is going to be very limited. And there's a fair chance, unfortunately, that there will be other people from my language background that are working there as well. And so now my 8 hours a day are either not speaking English or remaining in my native language. Okay, so that, and as an adult, it slows things down. My ability to pick up the language is a little bit tougher.
And I have to interject for a second. It frustrates me when I hear people say, well, you live in America, you should speak English. And I don't think people realize how daunting, first of all, the English language is. That's number one. Mm-hmm. I mean, plenty of people born here can barely handle the English language.
Right.
And two, the comfort and safety zone of being with people that speak your language. I mean, it would be like if you took an American and threw them on, the planet Zolark, and suddenly they're not speaking Zolarkian. They don't know how to speak that. How lonely would that be?
Right.
And to not understand that,
well, one of the things that comes up with language skills as Americans, most of us learned the one language that we know as very young people, and we don't really have a sense of what it takes to learn to speak a language. Okay? A good way to think about it is, if I got a guitar, it may take me a couple of months just to get, to where I could handle something like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Going out on tour is years down the road. Okay? And that's a good way to think about people who are learning to communicate in English. When somebody can speak to you a little bit in English, it's not helpful for you to go full throttle and start giving them native level English, because they just can't work at that level. There are ways, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this, to kind of pitch your language level to work effectively with people who are language learners. So your point, I think, is really significant. Many people who are here whose English isn't perfect, it's easy to underestimate that it took them years, perhaps, to get as far as they are, and they're working on it really hard. But if my job is and again, I'm going to go back to my young father analogy. Okay, I wake up with my family at the house in the morning. We probably spend some time, eating breakfast, whatnot, there in the morning. Got to get everybody up, fed, off to school and whatnot. I go to work all day. Okay, so now I'm 8 hours in, and I've got that 3 or 4 hour window in the evening between, getting home from work and going to sleep myself. Stacking up language lessons on top of that is powerful, but that's a huge investment. I mean, it's like going to medical school or something like that. I mean, it's a really big deal for somebody to do that, and you can't just turn this ship around in a day or two. It takes somebody years of effort to make significant progress because of perhaps the circumstances of their employment, means that they only can even work on their language skills for a few hours a day. So now let's come back to previously we'd said, okay, if I'm working in a factory and I'm speaking my native language or not communicating all day long, the challenges that's going to bring up. Now, if I happen to get a job as a cashier, then all day long it's hello, how are you? I'm communicating with people. Even just the familiarity with making eye contact, saying hello, and having just that little short conversation, that gives you confidence, and then that person is so much more fortunate to be put into this sink or swim situation of using the language on a regular basis. So there's all kind of factors involved in how quickly a person can pick up the language. Now, I have known people who are in their 50s and 60s who come to the U.S., and they're absolutely giving it hell, and they really do make progress with their language. But think about it. If you're 50 years old and you move to Turkey, what are the chances of you really getting that language?
Well, like anything, there's going to be a few people who are exceptional at language skills, just like there's great mathematicians, and some are exceptional at music or whatever it is. Some people's brains work well for language.
Well, and I would say very significantly, it's often less a question of capacity as it is opportunity. And people who make progress with the language are often struggling to find the opportunity to make that progress.
Plus, America has fricatives. Not every language has fricatives.
I don't even know what's a fricative.
A B and a F and the L's and R's.
Sure. Tough sounds to make. I always heard that the sound in bird is the hardest sound to learn to pronounce if you're not born in a culture that produces that sound. Yeah. Fun fact. I don't even know if it's true, to be honest. So
it doesn't have to be true. This is America.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Well, now let's come back to our family. The kids are at school. The dad's off at work, and this is what typically happens. The woman is often at home taking care of the house, and the social isolation experienced by women can be really significant, especially perhaps because of maybe your religious background puts further constraints on who you're culturally familiar with, communicating with.
Or you might not even be allowed to speak to men that you don't know.
Right.
Without some other man you do know present. There's a lot of rules around that.
There are a lot of rules around that. And it's dismissive of a culture to say that that's right or wrong. It's just the way it is.
Absolutely.
It's just the way it is. It's like if I went to France, I wouldn't insist that my wife went topless at the beach. Okay? I mean, it's just unreasonable to do that. You know?
Right.
Okay, so people are where they are.
Yeah.
Okay, so now what's going to happen is my kids are going to pick up the language pretty quickly. I may, over the next few years, pick up the language to some degree. My ability to speak the language is going to make or break my opportunities throughout the rest of my life in this culture.
And it can also further separate a child from a parent.
Well, this is one of the challenges. Often the children are brought in to act as interpreters for the family. And so now, again, the man who's been accustomed to being the head of the family and for being responsible for taking care of business is relying on their child to translate with the teachers, to translate with the doctors. And so now I've got my kid translating my medical problems to my physician.
Yeah.
Think about the switch in roles that's involved there.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's something. All these these family dynamic things that happen within newly arrived families are quite challenging. And so my children, very likely, if I have children born here, now I'm thinking, living, my mental process is going on, let's say, for example, in Somali, and my children's mental process is going on in English. I may never really be able to communicate effectively with my own children. So this gap that occurs within the family of the arrival generation and the youth of that generation can be really profound. Mm-hmm. And so the challenges that your family is facing in adapting to the culture and in just maintaining your family, there are some huge challenges that go on.
Not only that, but I feel like as children, it's hard enough to be a kid.
Right.
And a teenager especially, where,
right.
I mean, when you're surrounded by everyone the same and you're a teenager, you're going to hate your parents for a minute anyway. So then throw into the mix where you're from a culture that might be vilified out of ignorance for whatever reason because you're different. So I come into junior high school and I'm ashamed, probably, because, I think that happens a lot.
Well, the human desire to fit in is really powerful.
Yes. My mother used to come to pick me up from junior high in her pert green rabbit, and I was like, you have to pick me up down there.
A block away. Right.
So, I mean, take all that other stuff and throw it in there, and that, I think, would create even more of a divide.
Right. So I think it's valuable.
Now I think that pert green rabbit would be badass, but wish we still had it somewhere in the family. Anyway.
I think my takeaway from all this is just to recognize that whether immigrant or refugee, it's good to remember that these folks are often really working much harder than you might suspect to overcome challenges that are not easy for you to detect, that are overwhelmingly significant in their own personal and professional lives.
Sure.
So that's kind of the takeaway from all of that.
Yeah.
And so then it's not too surprising when I become a grandparent, and again, I can't speak to my grandchildren at all.
Yeah.
Because then the children most likely have not translated that language down, and so there's some very significant things. And most refugee families that I talk to, it's not unusual for people to say, listen, my job, I got us here, I don't care. Everything goes into the success of the next generation. And so the sacrifices that are made for that are often just phenomenal and heartbreaking, because the kid can't really appreciate it probably until they grow up or have kids of their own. So there's some pretty significant stuff that goes on there. Yeah. So that's kind of what happens, that multi-generational experience of moving to a new country. And it's not just when refugees or immigrants come here. That's whenever any family from any place goes to another country or culture or whatever. Sure. But when you pile on top of it all of the trauma that probably went on for years or decades or whatever on top of it. So I really have grown to admire the refugees that I've worked with. Just for some remarkable
Do you have a
people.
particular story that you'd like to share?
There was one lady, there's so many, and in fact, I would encourage you, and maybe we can put a link to this on the podcast.
I always put the links up.
I did a little YouTube, or I did a short film that's on YouTube. You can look up Our Story, Refugees, Portland, and there are some 5 or 6 different refugees telling a little bit about their stories. of what happened, before coming to the U.S. and then kind of their experiences of being here. So I would look into that. I think that the refugees speaking for themselves is pretty powerful.
I'll definitely put a link up for that.
Right.
On the website.
Okay. And then let's see. There were a couple other things I wanted to kind of cover with you. Refugee children, the refugee stories. Okay, so having said all that, how are we doing on time?
Got about another 15 minutes.
Okay, well then let's go from some of this background information into some kind of practical things that you or I could do because again, I think that the capacity to communicate in English is a real deal breaker for a lot of folks. It's going to either open or close doors throughout their lives here. Mm-hmm. And so how, as a member of the mainstream or native-born culture, what's your side of the bridge? If these people are working their asses off trying to pick up the language, what can you do to try to help build the bridge from your side?
Sure.
To ensure more effective communication.
Yes.
Okay, so let's wrap up with some practical tips here.
What can you do?
Yeah. What can you do
Grace
to help
and humanity goes a long way.
Yeah, it does. The first step, honestly, is I think that it's easy to underestimate the significance of just connecting with the person as a human. Okay? If I go to the store and I'm looking for something, I'm a lot better served to just start out with hello, how are you, than to just dive right into where's the bacon. Okay? Just making that human connection with somebody with a smile and a hello is a really big deal. Mm-hmm. Okay? Trying to communicate as a language learner is pretty intimidating for a lot of folks. Now, some people are just fearless and they'll go for it. But most people, you can do a whole lot for them just by giving these kind of social cues that I'm not going to beat you up for making a mistake. Okay? So I always say start out with a smile. Everybody gets what a smile is. And a hello. That's a really big deal. Okay? So that's one of the first things you can do. And then practically, first thing, put space between your words. Okay? So it may sound awkward, but when we're speaking in English, like if you hear somebody speaking Spanish and you don't speak Spanish, it sounds like they're talking really fast.
Super fast.
It's not that they're talking fast, it's just that you don't know the language and you can't distinguish the space between the words. You're not mentally making each word in your head because you're just hearing a series of sounds.
I always say I read French at a 4th or 5th grade level, but I hear it at a 1st grade level.
Right. That's a great way to think about it. When you're reading something, you can tell one word from the next because physically there's a space between the words. Now, when native speakers are communicating with each other, we often omit that space. Okay, so one of the best things that you can do is to put space between your words. Okay, so now I'm going to say this normally. Okay, what are you going to do after work? Okay, now compare that with what are you going to do after work? Now you can hear the difference between those two, and that difference, it feels a little bit awkward to talk like that.
It almost sounds angry, because we're used to, when we get mad at each other,
right.
Native speakers will be like, I said this.
Excellent point. But what you're doing,
is a lot, I think.
Putting space between your words. And again, it's tough to teach yourself to do that, but that really helps the other person. If I was going to say top 2 rules, number 1, smile, number 2, put space between your words. If you can only remember 2 things, those are huge helps to the person that you're trying to communicate with. Okay? So let me practice it on you. Okay? I'm going to say something naturally as I would naturally say it to you. You say it back to me with space between the words. Okay? What time do you want to meet?
What time do you want to meet?
That's it. And in fact, your listeners can tell you were smiling when you said that. You can hear a smile. Think about it. You can hear when somebody's smiling on the phone. Okay? That's part of what's going on. So great. Fantastic job on that. Okay. So rule number 1, smile. Rule number 2, put space between your words. Number 3, pronounce the last sound of words. Okay? In American English, we tend to drop the final sounds of things, especially in American English.
Especially country singers.
Is that a fact? Huh.
we drop the G off of everything. Singing.
Right.
Tapping,
Okay, good example.
walking,
Good example. So the one I put down here is I want to go to the park. Okay, that k in park almost always disappears. We tend to just kind of stop a sound.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
so,
wanna instead of want and all
I want. Yeah, exactly. So taking the time to put those final sounds on
Rainy
words.
in Spain.
There you go.
Was
Right.
mainly on the plane.
It really helps folks out a lot because oftentimes they've been exposed to it. Students all the time saying, I'm in class, I can understand my teacher, I can understand what's in the book, I go out in the street and I've got nothing, okay? And so what we're talking about here, again, is situations where communication is the goal. Mm-hmm. There are times when you're trying to teach somebody something that you do want to use slang, that you do want to speak naturally and normally. I mean, that's the eventual goal, but sometimes you're trying to get a point across.
Sure.
Okay, so that's what we're talking about.
And be patient.
Be patient.
That's got to be on the list somewhere.
It is. Okay, so come back. Smile, number one, space between the words, pronounce the last sounds of words. The next one, I'd say speak in a normal tone of voice. There is a tendency for people either to start talking louder when they're not effectively communicating. That makes the other person uncomfortable.
Sure.
And then we can also kind of baby talk people and kind of speak to them as if they were children, which is insulting to an adult.
Absolutely.
Okay? So maintaining a normal and positive tone of voice carries a lot of weight. And just try to keep track of using really basic words and simple grammar. Okay? When we're communicating in English, we tend to say things in very polite ways that are grammatically quite complex. Or we tend to use words that are sort of complicated so that we can give the impression of authority or intelligence. Mm-hmm. And those things can be really challenging. So again, I got a couple of examples to flesh that out. Okay, so let's look at this. If I was to say to you, could I get you to run down to the store and pick us up a case of Coke? Okay, this could I get you to... That makes a lot of sense to you. Yeah. I'm being nice. Yeah. I'm assuming that I'm making an imposition on you, and in my language, I'm recognizing that. I'm being polite. I'm being respectful. To a language learner, that's a very complex chunk of words. Okay? So again, could I get you to run down to... The run down doesn't make any sense. The could I get you to doesn't make any sense. Sure. Pick us up. That's case. Slang. There's a lot of language in there that's difficult to decipher, and most of it's in there because you're trying to be polite. Okay, so now let's compare that to please go to the store, buy Coke.
Right. That makes total sense.
Keep the please in there because you still want to show that respect to the other person in consideration of them, but simplify, not dumb down. Simplify the message. Okay.
I giggle because I remember being about my brother when I was young. I'm 7 years younger than my older brother. Okay. And he got his ears pierced. Okay. And it was dinner time. My family's sitting around the dinner table, and I know my brother's ears were pierced, but my parents do not know this. And my father glances over at my brother Jeremy and sort of takes it all in, and then he says, I'll never forget this. It actually burned in my brain. He said, self-mutilation for the purposes of adornment is a characteristic of a savage people. That's what he said.
That is a mouthful.
I know. And when I later retold that, my friend was like, what does that mean? I said, it means you shouldn't have got your ears pierced, you dumb kid.
Right,
that's what that means, Right. And language is everything.
Sure.
It's funny.
No, you're heading in the right direction there, yeah. Look at your message and don't dumb it down, don't baby it down. Just simplify the way you're saying it. And then finally, asking someone if they understand is usually pointless. Asking a language learner if they understand something, they are usually so intimidated and so nervous about trying to communicate with you in the first place that they're not... admitting ignorance is culturally not cool for a lot of people.
Well, it's a patronizing statement no matter who you're saying it to anyway. Do you understand?
Well,
it can be very patronizing.
What's often happening, honestly, the native speaker is often uncomfortable with the interaction as well, because as a native speaker, I'm not getting the kind of feedback that I expect from somebody that demonstrates understanding. And so it's natural for me to say, do you understand? And then if the person says, yes, I assume they do, I can tell you from my experience, I would never assume that's a false assumption.
Yeah.
The person is more likely to say yes because they're exhausted from trying, they're afraid, they just want to nod and smile and get out of the interaction. And if you're counting on them to operate a forklift, now you've got big problems. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that do you understand is not really all such a useful way to do it. If in the forklift situation, if this was really crucial, I would ask the person to tell me what I just told them. That allows me to check their understanding.
That makes sense.
Okay, just that do you understand doesn't really do all that much. I'm going to go right back through those one more time. Smile, put space between your words, pronounce the last sounds of words, normal tone of voice, simplify your message, and don't bother asking somebody if they understand. Those are some of the practical things that you can do to build your side of the bridge in communication with someone else. I do feel like it's valuable for us to all share a native language here in the States. I do think that learning to speak English is, we need that common ground. It's not practically feasible, I think, for us to all learn to speak Turkish and Italian and Somali and all of the languages that are present here.
And I understand that. When I was saying that I get frustrated by people that say, well, you should speak English. And I get that. It makes sense logistically. All I'm saying is people should have patience.
That's right. And you should be part of helping them learn to speak English.
Absolutely.
Right?
If you're getting frustrated by your neighborhood bagger guy because he doesn't understand you asking him to take your stuff to the car, take 5 minutes and say, car, bag, walk, or whatever it is.
Right.
I mean, we're all in this together.
And just be aware of that they need to learn to speak English. I don't really disagree with that, but realize grandma and grandpa, you can't leave them in Somalia when everybody came here. They are not going to learn to speak English because of their age, more than likely. Those that are physically capable of learning the language, it's not an overnight success story. It can take years to get really comfortable. So be part. If you're going to insist that people learn to speak the language, I think that it's reasonable that we become a part of that process to make that as easy as possible. There are things that you can do to make that easier or harder for people.
Sure. We have a lot of people that are not native English speakers here in Nashville. For whatever reason, I come from Seattle where, of course, there's tons of people that are not necessarily English speakers. But I find it's always a nice bonding moment when I meet somebody and I say, tell me how to say this in your language.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Because then suddenly I don't know something, they don't know something.
Right.
And I find that a nice moment.
Right. Well, it casts the other person as an authority, which as someone adapting to a new culture is often an experience that they so rarely get to do.
Yeah.
When the other person is able to contribute in a way that that they're comfortable and confident with, that's such a big deal to people. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to go to somebody's house and they cook a meal for you is such a big deal for them. I benefit tremendously because I get to eat all this great food. They get to do something for me in return. And honestly, I truly believe I really, really believe that most folks want to become contributors. They are big-time believers in the American dream in ways that, as native-born Americans, we really can't appreciate what a big deal it is. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's crazy to be concerned about. We see terrorism a lot in the world today. There's a lot of horrible things that are going down right now. I don't think it's crazy to be concerned about that. But I think that when I think about refugees in the U.S., broadly speaking, I'm certainly not intimidated. My general impression is these are people who want to contribute, who want to be part of making America just a great place to live. They want their kids to be okay. They want their families to be okay. They want to contribute. They want to give back. And they're doing 9 times out of 10, they're knocking themselves out trying to make that happen.
I saw a video the other day. It was a room full of people from all over. Mm-hmm. The video was filmed in Europe, I'm assuming. and the panelists individually interviewed each person and said, is there any particular, what's the word, ethnicity, whatever, that you don't like?
Okay.
Just across the board or whatever. And so somebody would say, oh yeah, I don't like the Turks, or
okay.
I don't like the Germans, or I don't like the whatever. So we went down through the line asking these people. And then they gave them all a DNA test. Spit in the tube goes off, they reconvened. And then in front of everyone, they came forward, and their results were given, and they had to read them aloud of what their backgrounds were. And inevitably, of course,
there was some of that.
Some of the thing that they hated about whatever and the reason that they hated whatever race or whatever they were in some percentage. Right. And one of the women interviewed. It turned out that two people in the audience were cousins.
Wow!
I didn't even know it, and they were from opposite side. One was I think one was maybe Syrian and the other one was Israeli. Okay. Yeah, and they were like second cousins or something like that. And which was a really profound moment for them. Sure. And anyway, the woman said every human being should take this test. Mm. And I was like, man, wouldn't that be something? Yeah. Because suddenly these walls, that we build in our minds about why we're better than or less than, would have to sort of really,
put some cracks in those walls.
It really would, because suddenly these people that I don't like by virtue of no reason other than I don't like them, maybe I am them. Because truly we are. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that frustrates me the most about humanity. And my father will always say, it's always been this way. It's just now we know about it because mass media and all this sort of stuff. And I get that. Human beings are always trying to figure out a way to feel better about themselves. And the best way to do that is to feel worse about someone, to make somebody else the bad guy.
Climb up on somebody else's shoulders for a better view,
So, but it really touched me to watch that video and to think, yeah, man, if we all just spit in a jar and send it off to the lab, we'd realize that we're all the same. Right. With just some quirky differences here and there. Anyway, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. I'm going to put links and things up on the website, so please send me an email with some things you'd maybe like people to see.
I absolutely will do that. Yeah.
Is there any particular website that you can recommend if somebody wants to know more?
I think if somebody wants to know more, avail yourself of an opportunity to say hello to somebody that you might not say hello to otherwise, and just start opening those doors. That's the most powerful piece of this whole puzzle.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks a lot for coming over.
Hey.